Here from OC Hybrid Tech, and today I'm going to go through pretty much every engine that is installed in Toyota Priuses, starting from 97 all the way till 23. We're going to skip the 5th generation just because there's not enough data, and you know, at the mileages that they're at, you don't really need to watch out for anything yet. We will know, hopefully nothing, but we'll know. Essentially, we're going to go through the 1st generation and the engine that's commonly used in the 1st or 2nd generation Prius. Then we're going to talk about the 3rd generation Prius. We're going to go over their pros and cons, what to look for. So stay tuned, okay? But all right, guys. So first, we're going to go through the engine referred to as the 1NZ FXE. This is an engine that was found in Priuses starting from 97 all the way till 2009. There was essentially a pause in their production or installation in any Priuses from 2010 and 11. 2012, the Prius C returns, and this engine comes back with minor changes. Essentially, one of the only differences, it goes from a mechanical water pump to a electric water pump, but the timing and everything stays the same. This engine is actually one of the more reliable engines that Toyota has produced. It has won multiple, essentially early on its production, it won multiple awards, being 2000 and 2001, the most eco-friendly engine. 2005 and 6, they won both fuel efficiency and one of the best engines, displacements between 1.4 to 1.8 liter. I think that's why they even returned it back to Prius C, because they kind of saw that the engine is really good and it's too early for it to retire. In fact, this engine stayed in production all the way till 2018. So if you think about it, same engine for over 20 years. That's how good this engine is. There are some common issues to look for. This is essentially the same problem that's shared between most Toyota engines made in the 2000s, essentially, like starting from like early 2000s till late 2000s, and most of them were addressed after 2010, but oil consumption. So that's one thing you're gonna hear about this engine a lot. And that essentially, and it's a common problem on engines with well over 200,000 miles or neglected engines with less than that. So if you don't do oil changes in time, and we see examples of them inside, it looks like it went through a barbecue smoke session. Either way, so essentially we can, if with proper maintenance, these engines can do well over 400,000-500,000 miles. The best versions of this engine essentially are in the Prius C. That engine runs 0W20 oil instead of 5W30, even though it's thinner oil, but they tend to last longer, and not because of the oil that's used, but essentially because of the corrections that Toyota made to their piston rings. So we covered the 1st generation Prius. There are some other common issues with the 1st and 2nd generation Prius, but it has to do with essentially like inverter cooling and stuff. We're not going to get into that because essentially our goal was to isolate engines and keep going through it, because we get a lot of questions. So this way we can get to answer a lot of them at once. So again, this engine is also like essentially one of the main differences of this engine compared to a like similar year Yaris would be that this would be an Atkinson cycle engine. These are essentially a little bit more efficient because it's a higher compression engine. Essentially, they increase the compression, but on the they delay the opening of the intake side of the valve. So what this does is essentially it releases the pressure. Under stroke, it almost reaches atmosphere pressure, so like the pressure that's outside. This makes this engine a lot more efficient, as far as consumption, but it also makes it lose power, so you are down 20-30%. This is why they use only the FXE, so you'll see the letter X in all the hybrid engines. Essentially, that means that it has Atkinson cycle for the engine, and it means that essentially it's used because the power loss is compensated by the propulsion power of the hybrid system. So it can still work pretty well given that it only has 70 something horsepower. But that's pretty much it on this first generation Prius. You just need to PCV valve needs to get replaced essentially on these. That's a common problem. That actually starts the oil consumption issue. These are very easy. You do need to take off the windshield wipers and all that stuff, but it's a valve that gets opened up. That's a common failure point on these. Well, besides that, they're pretty good. Just keep up with your oil changes, and they should last a very long time. Next engine that we're going to move to is actually pretty much the polar opposite of this one. In fact, this is why Priuses for a while they were suffering from reputation of being problematic. So this engine is 1.8 liters. It is referred to essentially, this family of engine is the ZR family of engines, and they've ran for a long time, even before Priuses. But the most common version of it would be the one that's found in the Toyota Prius is a 1.8 liter. So the ZR family engines ran from 1.6 all the way up to 2 liter versions, but the ones that were installed in the Toyota Prius was only 1.8 liter. It is also an Atkinson cycle engine, so shares the same kind of pros and cons compared to the normal version, the auto cycle version. Down on power, better efficiency. Essentially, this engine suffers from a couple of problems. So we're gonna go over those and teach you guys essentially what to look for and go from there. So, this engine is now from 76 horsepower, they're up to 98 horsepower in this version. This engine ran in the Toyota Prius from 2010 to 2015. Toyota Prius V from 2012 to 18. I'm not sure, maybe 17 was the last year of production of that. It just moves back and forth a lot on those. And the CT200H, which ran from 2012 to 18 also. They're essentially, so a couple common issues. So this is a very important part. This is the part you guys want to pay attention to. So this is the first generation that Toyota went from mechanical water pump, essentially a water pump that's mounted onto the engine and essentially driven by the crank. So when you rev up the engine, it spins the water pump faster, you increase flow and all that. It's good, but the downfall in a hybrid version is that hybrids like to turn on and off, and hot water doesn't like ebbs and flows. So to do that, to bring optimal cooling, they upgraded essentially from a mechanical water pump that I don't have one here because they don't go out often, so we don't have a new one. They upgraded to to an electrical water pump. And this is a great unit. When it works, it's fantastic because essentially there's a lot of current flowing. The Priuses don't have shortage of voltage essentially. So it can continue running this water pump even if the engine is on or off, so cooling continues. The bad part about this, which takes out a lot of engines with it, including this one, essentially since it's an independent unit, instead of being like a peller that spins with the engine, it's an electronic connector here, and it has 9 speeds inside, or 8, don't quote me wrong. Essentially we just go through them. But so when the temperatures go up, it sees that it needs a higher demand, it changes speeds based on that. The problem is that if they stop working, when they fail, the engine continues to operate. Whereas essentially imagine a mechanical water pump, let's say it seizes, it's gonna stop the engine from running, sorry about that. It's gonna seize the engine from running, and then you get it towed to us, we get the water pump replaced, and it's all good to go. But on this one, which is on the 2ZR FXE, electric water pump, it can fail and the engine continues to go. So instead of having the coolant that flows from the radiator to the heater core, all the way throughout the car, a couple gallons, I believe, in capacity, you're limited to just the coolant that's inside this engine. Nothing is flowing anymore. And as you can see here, you have a pretty solid block. You have the cylinder head, essentially the only skipping point for all that pressure or steam essentially to skip would be the head gasket. And that's why you probably, if you search third generation Prius, the first 10 items will probably be articles regarding their head gasket. So that's one of the main causes of their head gasket. As far as we see essentially cars showing up with their freeze frame, we see the water pump essentially on one of the speeds it doesn't go. This is pretty tough. It doesn't spin freely. So this is a problematic water pump. That's why it needed to be changed. Besides the water pump, they have their common issues continue. Okay, so besides the water pump, the second problem is the EGR, essentially exhaust gas recycling. Now, you can thank Environmental Protection Agency. I believe this is one of their tricks that got added to the car. So essentially, when you turn on the car, when it's cold, it runs richer to get it up to operating temperature. Now, on a normal car, within 5-6 minutes, you're at operating temperature. But the problem with these cars, so essentially the engine revs up. You might have even noticed that you see your engine revving up a little bit higher, and then afterwards it goes down. While that's happening, your car runs with more gas than essentially air. So what happens then is, so on these hybrids where they turn on and off, it stays in that commonly known as choke mode on older cars, where you would pull it and it would increase the pressure. It stays in that mode for a long time. So what it does is it takes the exhaust gases to make sure there's no unburned fuel, cycles it back into the intake, which is also the next area of our common issue, and then it runs it through the engine one more time to make sure there are no unburned fuels. Now, if essentially where air used to travel, exhaust smoke travels through, and that builds up. So I don't know if that'll catch on the camera. Essentially, there are a bunch of little webs in here that get clogged up, and essentially smoke builds up, and yeah, it's essentially kills the flow to the engine, and you can have head gasket issues. It's not as common as the water pump, but it is uncommon. So, that EGR brings us to the third common issue on these guys. Unfortunately, of the engines that we're doing right now, we didn't have one that has a huge version of that problem. But if you look carefully, these ports are separated from the main one. Essentially, exhaust gas recycling flows through these back into the engine, and they are known to build up. Like this. Essentially, the EGR or the exhaust gases did not damage this engine, but as you can see, that's air intake, and this shouldn't come off of an air intake. So that's one of the other common issues. So where it's the weaknesses of this engine is actually the strength on this side. So the blocks on these are not known to have as much oil consumption. Yes, they will develop that if you have the bad head gasket and you keep running your car, keep overheating it. Yes, you will then at that point. But properly maintained, these blocks we've got, essentially on the second head gasket, sometimes even third head gasket, and it still, contains all 4 quarts after 5,000 miles of driving. So now that we've addressed kind of like the more problematic engines on the Toyota Prius, we're going to go through what makes Toyota so great. Essentially, even when they get something wrong, when there are common issues, they address them. They work very hard to address them. So the next engine we're going to talk about carries the same exact name as this engine, 2ZR FXE. But this engine is essentially the one that ran in all the Priuses, and the CT200 and the Prius V that we mentioned use what they call the metal top. Essentially, the valve cover is made out of aluminum, but they call it metal top versus plastic top. Essentially, the engine will look very similar to the one that you are seeing as far as the block and the head assembly. But one of the main differentiating factors are that when you pop the hood, you would see one of these on the older version and one of the plastic ones on the newer versions. That's the main visual difference, but we're going to show you guys what is different about their, what is different, sorry, I'm gonna lay that down there. What is the main difference between the design of it? What did they change? So we're gonna bring this engine up. So as you can see, the block of these engines look very similar. Let me see if I can bring this guy somewhere in the same angle as that. So if you kind of show them essentially through here and here, you will see that the blocks are in very similar shape. Now, one of the very big crucial differences between these, sorry, we're spilling oil too, but we'll clean that up after the video. So if you want to bring it in here and show, essentially this is the engine, this is the plastic top, right? So the green engine, the green block is the plastic top. I'm not sure if you can notice, but essentially there are these sleeves that are deep in here. And I'm gonna see if I can bring the light somewhere closer. But as you can see, these are essentially heat sleeves that are there to make sure that essentially the engine doesn't get as hot and cold as many times. Now, if you come over here, as you can see, very similar shape, right? Like essentially the block, the stroke, the displacement is all the same. But if you can see there's nothing in here. And that's kind of like essentially these engines are turning on and off hundreds of times. And this is where Toyota distinguished that that's their common issue on this one. So they just made a minor difference on that one. On the cylinder head, there is small differences too, but it's not major. Essentially, it's not a benefit, but you know, essentially the water, essentially the coolant hose on this one is a slip-on. It essentially clamps on here, but design-wise, it's very similar. In fact, the plastic top 2ZR FXE is down on power a couple horsepower, but I believe essentially they knew that they were going to throw in the lithium hybrid battery packs and they were going to be able to give a lot more power. Therefore, they were able to afford essentially being able to even take the engine, make the engine's job a little bit easier. So we went through their common issues. Now, I want to show you guys a couple of problems that occurs in extreme negligence cases. So essentially engines that don't get very like common oil changes and what happens. So if you come over here, Dimitri, essentially one of the main things we see with the 2ZR FXE, so this engine, when they have head gasket issue, they continue to drive them essentially. They just go through it. So now you're putting, when your head gasket is damaged, you're putting water where oil is supposed to be and vice versa. The biggest problem is when you're putting, or coolant essentially, when you put coolant into the oil loses its viscosity or essentially efficacy because it will not lubricate these guys. And then this happens, which is catastrophically expensive. So I don't know if you guys can tell, that used to look like this, but essentially the whole engine renegated, and we can even see the sides of this essentially where it made contact with the piston, and you can kind of see it on this one how it's in better condition. So this is not a common problem with this. That's why I kind of wanted to separate them so you're not as bad, you're not as paranoid about it, or your radar is not like full alert. But there's still issues that you should address. We see that essentially neglected, the crank even gets damaged, but these are rare cases. I would blame the owner at that point. But head gasket on the 2ZR FXE that ran essentially the metal top ones, that's just the nature of this engine. It is a flaw as much as they wanted. The dealership might try to blame you for doing this or that, but this isn't a design flaw. Essentially, what we do to address that or try to get better life out of these engines is that we use OEM parts where it matters. Essentially, like timing chain tensioner, we use OEM. But the two parts that when we do this build that we use aftermarket is essentially the head gasket and head bolts. We go with aftermarket, the Felpro version. That essentially has a little bit more give. We also copper coat our head gaskets. So, essentially to make sure that it has more give. Because no matter what we do, this engine will turn on and off more times in a week than an average car does in a year. So to offset that, there is going to be some extra care that we're taking, the extra steps that we're taking. But besides that, you know, this engine will probably do another 150 to 200,000 miles before it needs a head gasket again. But yeah, so just to recap, first generation Prius, the first generation of engines in Toyota Prius is 1NZ FXE. It ran in the first generation Prius, second generation Prius, and the Prius C. Pretty good engines, not much to look for. Essentially, you want to see if it has oil consumption, if you can, if you can track down like an oil change. That's how we do to find out like if you can do a compression test, but that's more involved. But essentially our free version of telling our customers whether their engines are losing oil or not is monitoring the oil level while we're doing oil changes. So you know, if you run 5,000 miles and you only drain 1 quart, that's concerning. You definitely want to get we want to get that addressed. So that's one of the main things you have to watch out for their engines. Besides that, the engines are good. I'm not saying that the cars are great too, but there are other common issues. So I don't want this to be a video of you go and check the engine on a Prius and you're good. No, you want to check the catalytic converter, you want to check the ABS, you want to check a couple of other hybrid battery, but this is focused on the engine, and we'll probably make videos on other stuff that you need to do on the Prius. But that's recap of the first generation of them, and then the 1NZ FXC, and then to recap the, I would say the second version and version 2.2 would be the 2ZR FXC engines, and we'll recap on that real quick. Again, the metal tops are actually the most problematic. I would say if you are buying one of those Priuses, Prius V, Prius plug-in, regular Prius from 10 to 15, CT200, you really want to pay attention to this one. Essentially, you want to make sure it doesn't have head gasket issues. The way you can tell that is that, you know, you can do a scan on the car. You can kind of you run a code, and but a lot of people can change spark plugs on them, and the code will not come back for a couple of days. Essentially, that coolant needs to come and soak up the spark plugs before it's completely gone. So watch for that trick. You can do a compression leak test. Essentially, they're pretty fairly cheap. You can buy it and test it out. That takes a little bit of things. Essentially, you're going to need to be able to put the car on maintenance mode, run it for a couple of minutes, and then check for that. You can do a compression test. Usually with head gaskets, you will lose compression in those 2 cylinders. So if you are like, you know, you're losing compression in cylinder 1 and 2, chances are it's the gasket that's between them, or 2 and 3, chances are it's going to be that gasket is damaged and it's going to be around there. It could also be that the piston rings are bad, but that's not a very common issue on these ones. So compression test, leak down test, combustion leak test, sorry, not leak down test. I know someone's gonna leave that in the comments. And then that's it pretty much for the engine side of it. And then we'll recap quickly on the 4th gen, because I don't have much negative things to say about the 4th generation, which is this one. There are practically bulletproof. Is it this one that's messed up? No. If we can show, I forgot where is the really messed up one, but no, not this one. But essentially, we had one with 500,000 miles on it, and I believe the last guy drove it on a blown head gasket, which we'll retouch on the head gasket issue on the second version. It's not typically from the head gasket or water pump, EGR, intake manifold. That does not essentially kill the 2ZR FXE plastic top version. And we'll essentially, it's something completely outside of the engine. We'll touch bases on that. But right now we're doing the block. So the block doesn't have, the block is essentially what they've done. We don't have head gasket issues. I'm not gonna go into the science of it, not that I even understand some of it. But all of it, I guess. But essentially, this engine, all the problems of the metal tops solved on the plastic tops. The problem with these guys are essentially on the 4th generation Prius that ran from 16 to 23 is that the catalytic converter starts losing coolant. So you have to watch out for that. And I don't want to get into their catalytic converters because this video is not about their catalytic converter, but one thing unique about hybrid, or at least the 3rd and 4th, and I'm assuming 5th generation Prius, is that they use the exhaust to bring up coolant to operating temperature, because these hybrids in a cold, like in winter time, might have a hard time bringing up the car to operating temperature, so your heater wouldn't work or any of that. So what they do is essentially they use the exhaust system to bring up the coolant temperature of the car. That mechanism is bulletproof on the 3rd generation. So the first iteration of this, Toyota didn't get it wrong. On the version on the 2016 to 23, commonly it's that tank that leaks, the coolant goes out of your engine. So symptoms look like head gasket because you get white smoke from the exhaust too. So many mechanics have changed that engine and they didn't need to. And they, you know, if the coolant is leaking from the exhaust, and they're able to bleed it because it's leaking from the exhaust, again, it's not leaking from the cooling system, then they essentially tell the customer they're good to go. And usually the problem with that leak is it's slow, so it might take a week till they drain their coolant and they keep driving the car. And we've had head gasket issues, we've had to replace these engines before, but simply because of the catalytic converter being the main culprit, not much else. So watch the catalytic converter on the 4th generation Prius, watch everything on the 3rd generation Prius, and on the 2nd generation Prius, if you can, watch for oil consumption. And on the 1st generation Prius, I would just suggest you skip over it because there are complications outside of this engine being super reliable. Well, with that said, I hope this video was helpful. I hope you guys can use this and avoid a problematic car. And thanks for your time. This is Amir from OC Hybrid Tech. Have a good day.